welcome to the 21st annual lecture of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. I'm Lucy O'Brien, Vice Chair, responsible for all matters vice. If only. I'm very happy to introduce Kwame Anthony Appiah. He's Professor of Philosophy and Law at New York University. He's Emeritus, the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, and is an Honorary Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. I think it's delightful to have him here. As I said, the 21st lecture, we're nearly grown up. I think it's fitting that we're having the lecture here. If I've kept track of the branches of Kwame Anthony Appiah's family tree, then his great-aunt and great-uncle, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, were founders with George Bernard Shaw and Graham Wallas of the LSE. So, spiritual home in some way. Professor Appiah's early work focused on the foundations of probabilistic semantics, bringing together issues in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. His interests have ranged widely ever since. He's worked extensively in African and African-American literature and cultural studies. In My Father's House, Africa in the Philosophy of Culture, is an exploration of the role of African and African-American intellectuals in shaping contemporary cultural life. In 1986, please note how early that is, in 1996, he wrote with Amy Gutman, Color Conscious, the Political Morality of Race. In that book, Professor Appiah sought, as he put it, to clear the ground for a discussion of the place of race in politics and in our moral lives. This was followed in 2004 by The Ethics of Identity, which takes up the notions of race, religion, gender, and sexuality and explores the relationship between group identity and individual freedom. In Cosmopolitan, just note how many books. I've left out half of them. In Cosmopolitan Ethics in a World of Strangers, Professor Appiah argues that we concentrate too much on what makes us different rather than recognizing our common humanity. The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, explores the various dimensions of honor as it relates to notions of respect, shame, and dignity. His latest book, As If, Idealization Ideals, based on the Karras lectures, has come out, I think, last year. Professor Anthony Appiah became a household name in the UK with his 2016 Reith Lectures on Mistaken Identities. He's literally the only philosopher that my mother has got excited about when I said I was going to meet him. He's also the author of 3 novels and has reviewed regularly for the New York Review of Books. Professor Appiah's current interests still range over African and African-American intellectual history and literary studies, alongside ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of social sciences. His major current work has to do with the connection between theory and practice in moral life, but he's also working on a large project exploring some of the many ways in which we now think about religion. And that brings us to tonight's lecture and its topic. What is a science of religion? Professor Appiah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. So modern social science, I think of this talk today as contribution to philosophy of the social sciences. So that's That's where it fits. Modern social science is the creation of theorists who explored the role of religions in many areas of social life, giving it an explanatory role in doing so. They discussed acts, beliefs, feelings, experience that they thought of and called religious. Sociology and anthropology proposed from their very beginnings a scientific study of religion. I want to talk about some attempts to understand religion in this scientific way, and at the end I'm going to take the rise of the social science of religion as itself something we might want to try to understand. But let me start with a classical canon of anthropology and sociology of religion in the works of E.B. Tylor, the first professor of anthropology at Oxford, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim, who all died towards the end of the second decade of the 20th century. Tylor's account of religion, which is the earliest, is to be found in his great work, Primitive Culture, published in 1871. This is the book that I think entitles him to be regarded as the first cultural anthropologist, and it made his reputation, gaining him an academic stature that led to his eventual appointment a quarter of a century later on as the first professor of anthropology at Oxford University. Then I want to discuss Durkheim and Weber, in each case focusing on a major work, Durkheim's Les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, and Weber's discussion of religion in economy and society, the magnum opus published in 1922, a couple of years after his death. Tylor was raised as a Quaker and remained one. Weber's family was Calvinist, and Durkheim was the son and grandson of rabbis. Between them, these three, an English Quaker, a German Calvinist, and a French Jew, laid the foundations of the modern social sciences of religion. At the end, I want to discuss what I think is a representative piece of recent work in evolutionary psychology that aims to explain how some features of religion developed in our species. And we'll see that it addresses the very elements that were central in the work of the three founding fathers with whom I'm going to begin. Now, Tylor's great contribution to the social science of religion is the theory of animism he proposed in Primitive Culture when he offered his minimum definition of religion as the belief in spiritual beings. This definition seems clearer, I think, than it actually is. For looking through the hundreds of pages of Tylor's compendium of examples in 2 volumes, his spiritual beings are a motley crew. Many Confucians believe in ancestral spirits. The Romans had their manes, spirits of the dead, and their household gods, the Lares and Penates. But Romans also believed in nature spirits, in nymphs and satyrs, as well as in Jupiter and the other Olympians, and the hundreds of gods named in the Indigitamenta, the priestly list of gods that was held by the official priests in Rome. The Maori, to pick another example more or less at random, on the other side of the planet, have Maui, who played a leading role in Tylor's book long before he was discovered by Disney to star alongside Moana. But they also have a sky god and an earth goddess, gods of the sun, the sea, and the stars, of peace and war, beings with evocative names, Ranginui and Tanganura. And they have nature spirits as well, identified with trees, lakes, mountains. Many Jews have believed not just in Yahweh, but also in golems, creatures made from animated mud. Christians traditionally believe in demons. Orthodox Muslims believe in Allah, of course, but also in jinn, of whom only one is well known outside the Muslim world as the genie of Aladdin's lamp. But in all the Abrahamic traditions, you will find people who worry about ghosts and have faith in angels. If, as Tylor clearly thought, all these are ways of believing in spiritual beings, and spirits are so diverse, don't we need to say something about what, conceptually speaking, they all have in common? After all, our definition of religion involves belief in them, so we need to know what they are in order to know what our theory of religion is about. Tylor's central idea, encoded in the definition of religion as belief in spiritual beings, is that religion involves extending belief in the human soul, which accounts for the animation of a living body, into conceptual directions. First, we develop the idea that what animates us can live outside our body, and finally outlast it. That is the human soul. And second, we suppose there are other entities in the world than us that are soul-like. These two extensions together produce, in Tyler's scheme, the idea of a spiritual being. Once one has belief in spirits then, with powers over aspects of the world, worship, one aspect of the practice of religion, is just a natural human response to the spirits with whom we're interacting. Just as we placate people who have power over the things we care about, so we propitiate the spirits. The belief in these beings is primary. Once we have belief, practice can be seen as the reasonable reflection of it. In extending souls into the wider world, we generate naturally a system of quasi-social relations beyond the world of living human beings, our relations with spirits. Under the influence of Descartes, you may be tempted to suppose that spirits must be immaterial. But Tyler gives a cosmopolitan compendium of cases of traditions in which the soul is represented as a material substance, including, for example, the Tongans, who, he says, quote, imagined the human soul to be the finer or more aeriform part of the body, comparable to the perfume and essence of a flower, as related to more solid vegetable fiber. The extension of souls beyond humanity goes far beyond their ascription to animals and plants, of course, which, like human beings, can pass from life to death, and so may need a life force to explain that difference. For many things, including artifacts like drums or spears, can have spirits too, and some of the principal spirits, as with the Maori, inhabit lakes and mountains, the sun and the stars. Tyler gets closer to an account that covers all the thousands of cases he imagines and describes in primitive culture when he says, speaking more abstractly, spirits are simply personified causes. Now, Tyler represents this belief in spirits as a perfectly natural response to early human experience of the natural world. He doesn't think our ancestors are to be condemned for it. We could say, in a modern philosophical idiom, that Tyler's primitive men and women adopted what Daniel Dennett has called the intentional strategy, treating, now quoting Dennett again, the object whose behavior you want to predict as a rational agent with beliefs and desires and other mental states, exhibiting what Brentano and others call intentionality. It's just that our ancestors did this over a much wider range than many of us now think is warranted, and they based their appeal to these quasi-psychological states in the belief that they are the capacities of a sort of spiritual substance. We should recall, in deciding what we think of our ancestors here, that we too still apply the intentional strategy to things such as our pets and our computers that are not human. So, using the vocabulary of the contemporary philosophy of mind, Tyler's claim is that the core of religion is the application of the intentional strategy to a substance widely instantiated in the non-human world, having first applied it to ourselves. But human beings have explanatory schemas available other than the intentional strategy, of course. We understand certain events, the breaking of a tree limb by the wind, as a causal process, explicable without appeal to the will or the beliefs or the emotions of the tree, or for that matter, of the wind. Everybody understands the push and pull of efficient causality. People also have the idea that some things have functions, that hearts are for pumping blood, knives for cutting. In the contemporary world, with the rise of a scientific approach, we can give many more detailed causal explanations, allowing for much more successful prediction and control than was possible in earlier societies. Darwinism allows us to explain how functions arise without appeal either to agency or to design. And when things happen in the world around us, we moderns often turn naturally to an explanation neither in terms of agency, not that is by way of the intentional stance, nor in terms of design, but in terms of natural causality. Why did our ancestors so often do otherwise? I will later return to this question, why we humans have applied the intentional strategy to so many more things than ourselves. Many of us, whether raised within one of the world's many religious traditions or outside them all, are likely to feel that Tyler makes too little of the role of intense emotion in religious life. Only at the end of the last of the chapters on animism does Tyler observe that he has kept the intellectual rather than the emotional side of religion in view. Yet even, he says, among the rudest savages, religious life is associated with intense emotion, with awful reverence, with agonizing terror, with rapt ecstasy. Recognizing this, Tyler admits, some will complain that he has, quote, written soullessly of the soul. Yes, he responds, there is emotion there, but the feelings are the natural responses to the spirits. So it's the belief in spirits that is the heart of the matter. The belief is central, the feelings are a consequence of it. That Tyler doesn't talk much of religious emotion doesn't mean that his theory cannot encompass it, for belief in creatures with minds, something like ours, provides a quite reasonable base for an emotional response. Many of our emotions are responses to the intentional states of other humans. There's another great absence in Tyler's treatment of primitive religion, one that you might think goes with the absence of feeling. Primitive culture seems remarkably unattuned to the role of religion in shaping the ethical life of its adherents, by which I mean in the enforcement of norms, in their creation, and in their content. Tyler's defense here is that he is focusing, as he says, on, quote, primitive religion, on the origins of religiosity, and he believes that, quote, savage animism is almost devoid of that ethical element which to the educated modern mind is the very mainspring of practical religion. In the work of the two great sociologists of religion I want to consider next, both ritual and community play a much more central role, and the social meaning of religion extends far beyond the consequences of belief in spiritual beings into emotion and ethical life. But let's concede that Tyler demonstrated with an astonishing range and depth of ethnographic materials from the human past and around the world that a great deal of what we call religion can indeed be understood by seeing it as the projection of agency into the cosmos. In developing the theory of animism, the hypothesis that religion is at heart belief in spirits, Sir Edward Tyler delineated one paradigm for the scientific study of religion. Max Weber's most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is evidently only about one sort of religion. But in that book, he didn't say what made the Calvinist ethos religious. He doesn't say anything about what makes a religion a religion. All that mattered was that we could apply the term Protestant or Calvinist to a group of people and associate the label with a commitment to certain values and the behavior that flows from them. But Weber went on to explore religious traditions from around the world, publishing The Religion of China and The Religion of India in 1916, and Ancient Judaism over the next 2 years. He was engaged in trying to complete the section on religion in his Summa, Economy and Society, when he died in 1920 as one of tens of millions of victims of the Spanish flu epidemic. That work, the Economy and Society, was published in 1922, and the section on religion is known today in English as The Sociology of Religion. And here Weber had to face directly the question what made all these earlier works studies in some sense of the same thing. But Weber wanted the true nature of religion to emerge in the course of the study. So he didn't start with a definition. Indeed, he says, the essence of religion is absolutely not our concern. Our project, rather, is the investigation of the conditions and effects of a particular type of social behavior. For Tyler, individuals could seek the assistance of spiritual beings individually. What was social was only the source of their beliefs. Weber's interest is primarily in collective behavior that is organized through communities and their shared institutions and concepts. Tyler's religion could naturally be practiced alone. Weber's involves doing things together. Weber aimed to sketch, like Tyler, a framework within which all the religions of the world could be accommodated. And it's remarkably reminiscent to begin with of Tyler's. He starts, for example, like Tyler, with the most basic historical forms of religions as he sees them, and he asserts, like Tyler, that they are, quote, oriented to this world. Religion begins for both of them with getting things done in the here and now, not in a search for some hoped-for life beyond. Weber wants us to start with understanding the ideas that guide the religious behavior. So is there, he wonders, a concept that identifies something in the mental lives of religious adherents around the globe that underlies their behavior and that will provide a key to understanding this particular sort of social behavior? And Weber's answer is that there is, and he calls it charisma. Charisma begins as a technical term in Jewish and Christian thought, referring to the gifts of God's charis, his grace, as in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where they are listed: wisdom, knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy, the discerning of spirits, and the gift of tongues. All surely things worth having. Weber took this technical religious idea and applied it to special powers that could be found in certain particular objects and people, according not just to these Christian traditions, but to any religious tradition anywhere. When he first introduces the idea of charisma in the sociology of religion, Weber says simply that those who believe in magic acknowledge the lesser everydayness of things like a stone that is treated as a fetish, or of those people who can, quote, achieve ecstatic states and through them produce meteorological, therapeutic, divinatory, or telepathic effects. Powers like these, he says, have been given such special names as mana in Polynesia, Arenda among the Iroquois, and the Iranian maja, from which our word magic comes. And Weber proposes to use the word charisma for all these kinds of powers. The special powers of charisma can be found, for example, in icons or statues of saints in contemporary folk religion in Europe, that is, contemporary to Weber, which operate in what Weber calls a, quote, naturalistic, so-called pre-animistic way. So having read Tyler, we know that this means, that he means by pre-animistic, that these powers are supposed to work without imagining the presence within the charismatic object, the icon or the statue, of spiritual beings. That's what it is to be pre-animistic. Even though the process here is pre-animistic, Weber goes on immediately to say that in these cases too, people have imagined something behind the charismatically endowed natural objects, artifacts, animals, and human beings, concealed within them and somehow determining their behavior. And then he says, the belief in spirits. So if we stopped here, we might think that Weber's understanding of religion essentially just presupposes Tyler's. But Weber gives an account of his spirits that is clear enough that we can see that it's different. In the basic form, his spirits are not like human souls. They are, quote, something undefined, material yet invisible, impersonal and yet imagined as equipped with a kind of will, giving the concrete object its specific efficacy. And Weber does not see the basic intellectual strategy of belief in spirits as the projection of the human soul and with it an anthropomorphic agency into the world. So this is not the full intentional strategy. Weber starts in a different place, with charisma and with spirits much less like us. And as we shall see now, his emphasis on social behavior takes him swiftly in a different direction from Tyler. Weber thinks belief in charisma develops first in societies where magical powers are found in people with special qualifications, people he calls magicians, Zauberer. These professionals are permanently possessed of charisma. They are always capable of achieving ecstasy, which is the distinctive human state that both represents and mediates charisma. Ecstasy involves something different from what Weber calls the rational magic with which he began, the pre-animist, naturalist in the manipulation of objects with special powers. And it's available to laymen only within the social form that he calls the orgy, which is, he says, the primitive form of religious community. Now, the model Weber has in mind here is the Dionysian mystery cults of Mycenae and later of Athens, in which initiates engaged in collective secret practices, which were called orgies, which led to ecstatic experience, to reverie, rapture, hallucination, possession, and every kind of enchantment. Belief in the soul, then, as something distinct from the body, originates for Weber in this orgiastic experience, as the idea of something that leaves the body in ecstasy, but also in dreams, fainting, and death. Something that can be found, he says, behind, near, or in natural objects. Gradually, over time, those spirits come to be seen as normally invisible beings, governed by laws of their own, not living in or possessing objects, but symbolized by them. So the very idea of the human spirit, the soul, grows out of a religious practice, the orgy, rather than antedating and explaining it, which is what Tyler was saying. Weber's religion, unlike Tyler's, begins also unlike Tyler's, begins in a world of intense emotional experience. It begins with ecstasy and orgies. Though these spirits inhabit people and things to begin with, they are not yet fully personal. They need not have names. Indeed, they may not endure beyond their operation in a single event. So unlike Tyler's spirits, Weber's souls begin as something more like impersonal forces, albeit with wills, than people. Eventually, some souls do become enduring personalities, bearing the names of heroes, say, and then we have gods. But this is not really the significant issue. What matters is that religion gives a role not just to things and events that exist or actually happen, but also to things that have a meaning beyond themselves. Magic becomes, he wrote, a symbolic activity. Now, Tyler, too, had used the word symbol a few dozen times in Primitive Culture's 2 volumes. Like any reasonable observer, he noticed that religious acts are often, in some sense, symbolic. But it did not occur to him to see symbolism as central to religion, as Weber clearly does, or to insist on the most obvious reason why this must be so, even on an account that centers on the animist belief in spirits. For if these spirits behind the world are indeed like persons, we will need to communicate with them, and that requires working, as Weber puts it, through means that speak to a spirit or a soul, something therefore that has meaning, through symbols. For Weber, symbolic act has 2 dimensions. It has a form, which is often highly stylized or stereotyped, and it has a meaning. That meaning belongs to the world of the practitioner, so that what the acts mean, they mean to him or to her. While the term charisma belongs to Weber's technical vocabulary, he isn't describing that word itself to anybody except the Christians, this idea that some people and objects have a special power, whether they call it mana or arenda, belongs, or maga, belongs to the religious adherents' conceptual world. Weber thinks religion starts with the conviction that some people and things have extraordinary powers like these, derived from the presence of a spirit, which is something endowed with a kind of will. Over time, however, as the spirits develop personality, they become gods, associated with various social groups for which they have a special concern and over which they exercise a special authority. But the important distinction is not Tyler's distinction between gods, which are the aristocrats of the spiritual world, and other lesser spirits, but rather in the way we relate to them. It is the social form through which the gods are addressed that distinguishes them from other spirits. Quote, prayer, sacrifice, and worship mediated by priests are the markers of religion. Magic, managed by magicians, involves compulsion through spells and the like. The spirits compelled are demons. The spirits worshipped are gods. The differentiation between magic and religion, then, is connected with the distinction that Weber's just made between priests, who he thinks come later, and magicians, who are the earliest of the charismatic professionals with whom he began. And the core difference is that magicians work alone, while priests are part of a profession, operating what he called a continuously operating cult. Weber believed famously that human societies displayed a tendency to what he called rationalization. And priests are important for rationalizing through their shared activity in organized institutions, temples and churches, both theology and religious ethics. As we remember, Tyler had asserted that early religion was not much concerned with ethics. Weber agreed, but argued that the gods become increasingly involved in making ethical demands as social organization became more complex. With the rise of peaceful, law-governed states, the growth of a scientific understanding of the natural world, the increased regimentation of human interactions through conventional rules, and a growing dependence in economic activity on reliance on the word of others, these are all elements of what he called rationalization. With all these things, people become more dependent on expectations based on personal attachment to what he called a cosmos of obligations, which made their behavior more predictable. Now, religions not only supported the moral norms necessary for the coordination of social and political economic life, they generated their own forms of obligation, ritual practices whose point for the actor is that they are demanded by a god. Religion was not just the pursuit of ends given outside it, as in Tyler. Now, it had become itself a source of ends. Religion, then, is what happens when charisma becomes the institutional prerogative of a professional class. There's no need to worry about distinctions between monotheism and polytheism. Indeed, in the most rarefied forms of Buddhism, as Weber understands them, there is no need for gods or even for the soul. There is just the management of charisma. Without the concept of charisma, then, Weber's formal understanding of religion seems only to be just the very belief in spirits that defined Tyler's animism. And Weber's treatment of Buddhism shows that he believed that you could have religion without non-human spirits, because even as the Buddhists abandoned the Hindu gods, the priesthood and the management of charisma remain. So charisma has a lot of work to do. And yet, if one returns to Weber's introduction of this concept, it's almost as puzzling as Tyler's account of spirits. Charisma, recall, was introduced simply as involving powers outside the everyday. But in many societies, the sort of magic Weber discusses, the appeal by the Catholic peasant to the icon of the saint, which he begins with, in fact happens literally every day. What is distinctive about magic is not its frequency, but the kind of causality it involves, the appeal to hidden powers associated with something like a will. And though Weber insists that this does not yet need to entail belief in spirits, the idea of a will does involve the projection into the world of an aspect of our human psychology. The difference between Tyler and Weber, then, is something like this. Religion for Weber need not involve the full intentional strategy. Indeed, as we saw, Weber believes that the idea of the soul is the product, not the source of religious practices. It derives, as I said, from the experience of ecstasy in the orgy. And as we also saw, the distinction between magic and religion for Weber is a distinction in the social functions of magicians and priests. It is the social role of the person with the extraordinary powers, the organized continuing institutional cult that's associated with priests as opposed to magicians, that defines the distinction for Weber between magic and religion. Tyler, Weber, and Durkheim, to whom I turn more briefly now, offer an almost comical confirmation of national stereotypes. Tyler, the commonsensical Englishman, Weber, the German with his opaque profundities, Durkheim seeking in the proper Gallic fashion to construct a logical system of gleaming Cartesian clarity. In the introduction of Les Formes Élémentaires, the French philosopher-sociologist lays out a series of propositions that aim to introduce, at the end of that chapter, a formal definition of religion. Durkheim thinks religious beliefs, in societies both simple and complex, are in some sense about the division of the world of ideas and of things into two classes, which he calls the sacred and the profane. Quote, beliefs, myths, dogmas, legends are representations or systems of representations that express the nature of sacred things, the virtues and the powers that are attributed to them, their history, their relations with one another, and with profane things. Religion contains two main kinds of phenomena, of which belief of this sort is only one. The other is ritual, which is defined as behavior governed by the rules that prescribe how one should relate to sacred things. So the central idea is that everything's divided between sacred and profane, and ritual is any activity governed by the rules that prescribe how one should relate to sacred things. So the sacred is to Durkheim what charisma is to Weber, the key to unlocking the door of religion. And indeed, mana, arenda, and magic all figure as examples of the sacred as they did for Weberian charisma. Durkheim is keen to point out that his theory explains why you can count the more intellectual forms of Buddhism as a religion, even though it involves no belief in the soul or no gods, because, he says, the four sacred truths are sacred, and so therefore are the practices that derive from them, which are therefore instances of ritual, which we have defined as any activity governed by the rules that prescribe how one should relate to sacred things. The four sacred truths are sacred things, and so any behavior in relation to the four sacred things is ritual, and so we don't need spirits to have religion. So the first chapter of Les Formes Élémentaires offers a well-known definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices in relation to sacred things, which is to say, things separate and forbidden, beliefs and practices that unite all those who adhere to them into the same moral community called a church. And in the chapter's last sentence, he insists that in showing that the concept of religion is inseparable from the idea of a church, he has intimated that religion has to be something profoundly collective. So religion involves both a division of the world into sacred and profane and an institutionalized community that is held together through rituals connected with that very division. So our three theorists assume a human psychology and ask how, given that psychology, religious belief and action arise. But after Darwin, we see human psychology as itself something whose existence needs to be explained. We can ask why there are creatures like us, not taking us as we are, but asking how we came to be this way. Two central questions in this context suggest themselves apropos of religion. First, a question invited by Tyler's animist hypothesis: why are there creatures like us that adopt the intentional stance overbroadly? And second, a question made natural by Weber and Durkheim: what about religious behavior is adaptive? What explains its survival? So I want to consider just one representative recent attempt to explain aspects of the evolution of religion, an explanation that displays Taylorian, Weberian, and Durkheimian features. It's a story that aims to explain the origins of the very feature of our evolved psychology that Tyler took for granted, our propensity to overextend the intentional strategy, to apply it to things where our current view is it doesn't apply. The vocabularies of anthropology, philosophy, and evolutionary psychology are not the same. They are different professions. So rather than talking about the intentional strategy, as we philosophers might, or of belief in spirits, as Tyler did, evolutionary psychologists ascribe to the evolved psychology of most modern human beings what they call an agent detection device. Most brains are so formed, they think, that we have a module that leads us to respond to a wide range of experiences by attributing agency to something in the world. Very often, of course, that something is a person, an actual agent, and we understand agents by applying to them a folk psychological theory that supposes that they have beliefs, desires, and feelings, which evolutionary psychology calls theory of mind. It's easy to see why the complex of genes necessary to develop an agent detection device might have evolved. In a social animal, making sense of others is crucial to individual survival. Since we are in fact agents, creatures that conform more or less to the folk theory of mind, that being able to apply that theory will help you to get others right. But to do that, you'll need to be able to identify agents in the first place, identify the things that you can understand using theory of mind. Precisely because we are social creatures, dependent on coordinating our behavior with others, individual survival will be enhanced by the possession of that device. But this does not explain why it increases the Darwinian fitness of individuals to have what has been called a hyperactive agency detection device. Why, that is, should our tendency to ascribe agency have evolved to be triggered so often by things that are not, in fact, agents? Why should it behave precisely the way Tyler presupposed? The evolutionary biologist Dominic Johnson has proposed an answer. It begins, I should say, I'm not endorsing Tyler, I'm not endorsing Weber, I'm not endorsing Durkheim, and I'm not endorsing Dominic Johnson. I'm just trying to describe their views. It begins explicitly, as all the theories we have so far considered did implicitly, with what you might call methodological atheism. There is no God. There are no gods. You might think it follows that there could be no individual selective advantage to be gained from believing that they do exist. You would be wrong, Johnson argues. In God's absence, the very heavy investment in the activity of the Durkheimian Church is going to cost individuals a good deal. Prayer takes time away from farming or hunting, taboos limit diet and raise the cost of nutrition, priests and temples need support. So far, evolutionarily speaking, so bad. But suppose the advantages outweighed these admittedly significant costs. Johnson has a story about why it might. Let's start with another example of a habit of the human mind that leads to error. We're far more likely to mistake sticks for snakes than the other way round. Why should that be? Because the costs of mistaking a snake for a stick are almost always far more serious than the costs of the reverse error. No detector, whether produced by evolution or human design, will be perfect. It will make two kinds of errors. Sometimes it will fail to detect the presence of something it should, false negative. Sometimes it will mistakenly announce the presence of something it shouldn't, a false positive. In general, then, according to what's called error management theory, a well-designed detector should avoid the mistakes that are most costly at the expense, if necessary, of increasing the rate of the less costly kind of error. In the case of snake detection, the higher cost mistake is the false negative, mistaking a snake for a stick. The hypothesis that a hyperactive agency detection device can be adaptive requires that the more expensive error is the false negative, failing to identify an agent when one is around. But why? Johnson's answer starts with a solution to another problem about the evolution of sociability. The development of complex societies clearly requires a great deal of cooperation. Indeed, that is what it is for a society to be complex. A recent line of literature demonstrates with mathematical models that one way to support such complex coordination is by establishing an inclination that in fact exists in most human beings to punish those who breach social norms, even when we are not ourselves their victims. The bottom line is that it is reasonable to defect from a social norm in many contexts only if you can reduce the costs of detection. Now, among the very significant consequences of the development of theory of mind and of language are these. People get better at identifying the motivations of others, including their incentives to defect, and they are able, through language, to communicate the fact of defection to others. The result is that in creatures like us, the risks associated with defection are significantly higher than in social creatures with neither language nor theory of mind. Even if you think you're not being watched, you may be, or others may infer your defection from its traces, including its traces in your own later behavior. You may think you may get away with the lie, for example, but the cognitive task of keeping track of your lies can be high and may eventually show you up, as may the arrival of someone who knows the truth. And so not only is the likelihood of detection high, its costs are high too, since they extend to the responses not just of those who witness or infer your defection, potentially to all those with whom they can communicate. In these circumstances, the cost of wrongly thinking your defections will escape discovery can be very high indeed, and may be higher in some than the costs of conformity. You had better notice all the agents you can. In these circumstances, Johnson argues, there may be individual selective advantage in having a tendency not to defect, in being inclined, that is, to do things that are both good for the community and genuinely biologically costly, because the expected imposed social costs of detected defection are high. And belief in invisible spirits would be a mechanism for securing such prosocial behavior, because, of course, if the spirits are always around and can be invisible, and if, like human beings, they can both punish you and communicate your defections to others, you will always worry that defection risks detection and punishment. This is an argument for the proposition that Taylorian animism is the consequence of a hyperactive agency detection device that is individually selectively advantageous, because we cannot be sure that we will evade detection even when we think there is no one around. Not because the spirits are indeed watching, of course, but because human beings equipped with theory of mind and with language are more likely to learn about and punish our defections than is true among our fellow primates. Like the founding fathers of the social sciences of religion, modern evolutionary psychologists have conceptions of religion. They include belief in spirits, Tyler, the endorsement of prosocial norms, Durkheim, and ritual behavior, Weber, none of which would have surprised my three founders. But in the actual explanations, of which I've just offered a representative flavor, each of these elements need to be identified separately to do its explanatory work. In religions where one or other was absent, parts of the explanation could still be appealed to. Just as in Weber's account of the Protestant ethic, the idea of religion doesn't play an explanatory role, so in Johnson's account of why error management theory suggests that we might have a hyperactive agency detection device, what's needed is just belief in invisible agents and prosocial behavior, not the whole panoply of actual religious life. For Tyler, Weber, and Durkheim, the real question, as they looked out from Europe on the wider world, was, I think, in effect, this: what do they have instead of Christianity? And if that is right, it won't be surprising that religion is a paradigm of what Wittgenstein taught us to call the family resemblance concept. Each religion, like every member of a family, is no doubt like every other in some respects, but there need be no distinctive characteristics they all share. Remember what Weber said: the essence of religion is absolutely not our concern. That's a good thing if it doesn't have one. The Christianity that surrounded our three founding fathers was a set of traditions that had been shaped over millennia. But their sources for thinking about religion, outside the great literate traditions of Asia, China and India, and of the Abrahamic traditions, were largely materials assembled by Europeans in their global expansion since 1492. And by and large, they had called anything a religion that was in competition with the Christian ideas, practices, and traditions they had left behind. The result is that many people in our intellectual tradition unwittingly take as the paradigm of religion one particular set of religious sects, those that developed out of medieval Christendom in the coincidence of the Age of Exploration and the Reformation. That's why, for example, belief in God and in the soul is taken to be one mark of religion, even though there are atheistic forms of Buddhism that have no place for either God or the soul. A Christian model of religion is going to look for more than belief in spirits, of course. It will expect churches, priests, Durkheim, Weber, prayer, Tyler, collective worship, Durkheim, moral codes, Weber and Durkheim, and yes, charisma and the sacred. It will reject magic, even when it practices it. And it may pay less attention to things that people in other traditions might think obviously important: dietary rules, ancestral cults, both of which had largely disappeared in European Christianity by the end of the 19th century when these theories were developing. Now, when we approach a society that is not our own, seeking to understand its thought and practices in a scientific way, we will always have to begin with an enterprise of translation. Social science begins, as Weber insisted, with understanding the conceptual world of those whose behavior we seek to explain. The sociology of a Christian society would naturally use Christian concepts to try to make sense of non-Christian ones. But translation isn't just mapping concepts into concepts. It involves triangulating their concepts and our concepts with reality. And to see what I mean here, let me give quickly a simple example from the history of chemistry. From a current scientific point of view, late 18th century chemistry looks as though it classified some things, acids, for example, by and large correctly, even if a lot of what they said about those things was pretty badly wrong. They had theories of acids, they were terrible. Also, from the point of view of current theory, an acid is, roughly, a proton donor. Our recognition that the classification of acids and bases was itself an intellectual achievement is recorded in the fact that we're inclined to say that when, in the 18th century, Antoine Lavoisier, who, not having any idea of the proton, could hardly be expected to have had the notion of a proton donor, used the word acid, he was nevertheless talking about proton donors. He was talking about what we call acids. In explaining why it seems proper to think that Lavoisier was referring to the things we call proton donors, even though much of what he believed about acids is not true of proton donors, philosophers of science, and vice versa, much of what's true of proton donors isn't true of some of the things that Lavoisier called acids. Philosophers of science have drawn, as you know, on what causal theory of reference in the philosophy of language. The proposal is simple enough. If you want to know what object a word refers to, find the thing in the world that gives the best causal explanation of the central features of the usage of that word. If you want to know what the name London refers to, find the object in the world that is at the root of most of the causal chains that lead to remarks containing the expression London. With acids, because we believe that the stuffs out there in the world that really accounted for the central features of Lavoisier's acid talk really were acids, we conclude that he wasn't simply talking about something else or about nothing at all, even though much of what he believed about acids was wrong. So a science formed on this model by Christian believers would proceed by mapping the ontologies of other societies as closely as they could into their own. And that, after all, is what the missionaries who came in the wake of European empires to large parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas did. in the very societies about which the first anthropologists were writing, where they found, as they often did, evidence of belief in what was called the high God, associated with the heavens, the sort of monarch of the spiritual world described by Tyler. They took this as evidence that the locals had recognized, however imperfectly, the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As for nature spirits or totemic gods, these were either idols, man-made objects mistakenly believed to contain or represent a lesser divinity, or the powers for which the New Testament used the words daimonia and pneumata, which the King James Bible translates as devils or spirits. Now, I want in closing to suggest that there's a reason the sciences of religion can't be like that. And it has to do not with the nature of religions, but with the ethos of science. Tyler, Weber, Durkheim, 3 nations, 3 religious traditions, 3 languages in conversation. Science aims to be a discourse that transcends local identities. It is deeply cosmopolitan. To offer a local metaphysics at its basis would produce a discourse that was not recognizable as a contribution to the cosmopolitan conversation of the sciences. That's one reason why Soviet ideas of socialist science, which inspired Lysenko, or the even worse Nazi-inspired ideas of a German science, belong somewhere in intellectual history, but not in the history of the sciences. So a science of religion cannot appeal to the identities invoked in any particular region, which explains what I earlier called the methodological atheism of our 3 founding fathers. This cosmopolitan ideal, the calling of the scientist on the one hand, and the concern to understand the ideas of other cultures on the other, can therefore pull in different directions. Understanding requires us to appeal to our own concepts, but not to our own truths. In the explanations, though, truth, the universally shared reality, has to matter, because the scientific story of religion has to work for people of all faiths and none, precisely because it is cosmopolitan. But as we saw with Lavoisier, we may need to appeal to the truth to figure out which of our concepts provides the best local analogue of the ideas of the stranger. So the distinction isn't so sharp, that is, the distinction between appealing to our concepts and our truths, because concepts presuppose truths. If there really are no spirits, many conceptual questions about spirits don't really arise. Are they material? Can they be in 2 places at once? What would that mean? Once you sense the paradoxes here, you may lose your grip on the concepts. You may decide that these spirits, like the word witchcraft, which many of us don't believe refers to anything real, are like the word witchcraft, which many of us don't believe refers to anything real, rather than Lavoisier's acid, which we think does. Now, as we've seen, not everything we call a religion will have historical Christianity's laser-like focus on ontological truth claims. Still, so long as there are people making truth claims about gods and spirits in the name of religion, there will be a tension between the very idea of a science of religion and some of the multifarious collections of beliefs, practices, and institutions that make up what we now call religions. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. If you could put your hands up, you could put your arms up so I can see, and I'll take them down. You with the glasses.
I'm fine. For others to hear us. Hi. My question is to you is going to be quite a personal question, so I understand if you don't want to answer it. Having actually been a scholar of religion and all the rationalizations that have come before you, what is your religious belief and how have you rationalized it? Or, I mean, is it something that you've rationalized for yourself? Or is it something I would call faith or a belief? Do you believe that something is or isn't without any rational reason for it? Thank you.
Well, two things. I have mentioned a bunch of theorists saying what they thought constituted religions. I didn't, in fact, I explicitly didn't endorse any of them. And in order to decide how to answer your question, I'd have to commit myself to some view about what religions actually are. And I find myself, at the moment anyway, disinclined to do that. I don't mean at this very moment right now when you ask this question. I mean at this very moment in my intellectual life, as it were. Because, precisely because it seems to me that insofar as one can make sense of the concept, it is a sort of family resemblance concept. And so anything that's sufficiently like some existing religion is going to count as a religion. And, but it's going to be sort of debatable, contestable, arguable about whether something is sufficiently like anything that is currently clearly a religion to count. And so people debate whether, in the 19th century, people debated whether, well, they even debated whether Mormonism was a religion, but people debate whether Scientology is a religion, and so on. So here's what I could say. There are things in my life that seem to me like some of the things in the religious lives of some people. And they're there in part because I was raised in a particular religious tradition. But they don't happen to include very much on the metaphysical or ontological side of things, though my general epistemological view is that one should not be overconfident of one's metaphysical beliefs, that it's extremely hard to get to the truth about these matters, and that reasonable people can differ about them. So while I don't have what you might call, what a Christian would think of as, or for that matter anybody in the Abrahamic traditions, would think of as a sort of theological commitment, that lack of a theological commitment is not something that I think of as hugely, as it were, well, to go back to the work I first did, I wouldn't assign it a subjective probability close to 1. But I think that one of the interesting things about the way, one of the good things particularly I think in Weber, is that he has a story about how sort of things grow out of each other. So that one thing you could say about his concept of religion is that it's a historical concept in the sense that, roughly speaking, to be a religion is to be one of the things that has grown out of the first religions by some reasonable process of, some reasonable historical process that doesn't leave it, as it were, the first things too far behind. And, if you think of it that sort of way, then lots of things like, say, some forms of contemporary Unitarianism, which are not theological, are nevertheless continuous with forms of Christianity that are theological. And so it's not unreasonable for Unitarians, including the atheist Unitarians, to claim to be Christians, in my view. So that's why I can't give you a straight answer to your question, but I hope that that curvy answer, or that helical answer, or whatever it was, tells you roughly what I think about those issues.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I was wondering about Durkheim's idea about how sacred belief, it seems to follow that the ritual is therefore sacred, and because it's a question that I concern myself with generally. I wonder if you could elaborate more on that and say what you think about it maybe as well.
Well, so what Durkheim defines ritual as behavior governed by norms that reflect the distinction between sacred and profane things. At least he does. I should say, all of these people say many things about this question about everything they say anything about, and I'm just reporting, what I just reported was what he says officially in the first chapter of the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, when he's trying to say what he thinks rituals are.
And does he therefore think that the rituals are sacred if they are based on beliefs that are sacred?
No, it's the things that are sacred, and ritual behavior in relation to things conceived of as sacred, or in relation to the distinction between the sacred and the profane.
Okay.
So, I mean, that doesn't explain lots of interesting things about a vast number of the rituals that are actually described in Tyler or in Weber's many, many books about religion, or in Durkheim. I mean, Durkheim's ethnographic examples in the Elementary Forms are basically all taken from what he calls Aboriginal totemism. They're taken from the religious lives of Australian Aborigines. One feature of those rituals, as of Catholic rituals or Jewish rituals, is that they have some of the features of ceremony. And it's not obvious why, if you have a distinction between two kinds of things, one of which is somewhat set off, the sacred, the way you relate to them has to be ceremonious. Why does it have to be through ceremony? Tylorians have an answer to the question why ritual has to be ceremonious, though it's a little bit circular. It says ceremony characterizes our relations with agents, especially in traditional societies. And so it's natural that when we extend agency away from actual agents, we're ceremonious in relation to them in the way in which we're ceremonious in relation to our families and our chiefs and our farming in a traditional society. So it takes it for granted that there's a connection between responding to something that's person-like and being ceremonious. Now again, that might strike us as strange because we have lots of instrumental, in our kind of society, lots of instrumental relations with other people, which are not necessarily very ceremonious. And we don't necessarily have highly ceremonious relations with our intimates either. We have a lot of very unceremonious relations. Speaking personally, I grew up in a place in West Africa, in Ghana, where it was still the case that relations between persons in the family context were extremely ceremonious. I greeted my grandfather every morning, every morning that I saw him, in a certain way, and so we had very ceremonious relations. I don't think that most of my contemporaries at Cambridge in England had parents who thought that the right way to respond to your family every morning was to engage in various ceremonious interactions with them. So society's different that way. But at least for Tyler, he thought it was or for the Tylorians, they thought it was clear that there was a reason why ritual had to be ceremonious. It was dealings between persons, and dealings between persons are ceremonious. As I say, I don't think that's a terrifically good answer, but that is the answer that they gave.
Thank you. Yeah.
John?
Thank you very much. Sorry, this is really an attempt to get a little bit clearer about the range of what you had to say. I mean, the implications, as it were. So you talked principally about the anthropology of religion, and then had things to say about a particular approach in psychology, an evolutionary psychological approach. But as you know, there's a whole sociology of religion, for example, and socio-historical theories. I mean, Marx has things to say about religion and the reflections on the German problem and so on. And within psychology, you have people like William James and the varieties of religious experience, having a different way of trying to taxonomize these things. I just wasn't absolutely clear, and maybe you could just help me with this. Is your thesis that there is a problem for a science of religion because of the diversity and, as were, lack of an essence in the phenomenon, and therefore there just isn't the kind of unity in the thing that could make possible a science of it? Or is it to do with the fact that, as it were, in order to get a grip on it, there'd have to be a degree of kind of endorsement of some parts of what's being said in order for there to be a kind of fixity of reference at all? I just wasn't quite sure which of these you wanted to emphasize.
So it's more like the second thing, that I think there are in order for us to develop a science of these things, it needs to be the kind of thing that can presumably be discussed by people who hold, as it were, who come from all the different places that you might come from in respect to these things. That's difficult to do because the process of interpreting not just the utterances but the behavior of people the behavior that we're calling religious is hard to do while remaining sort of abstemious in our ontology. So that in a way, I think, at least as natural as the response to the phenomena that Tyler developed, and Tyler remained an active member of the Quaker tradition. He went to meeting. In that respect, he's different from Weber and Durkheim, who were not pratiquants. They didn't practice any religion, though they were raised in one. Tyler responds one way, but the anthropologists, as I said, the missionaries who are traveling out looking at the same things at about the same time, respond in a different way because they have a richer ontology that they feel free to draw upon. Tyler doesn't explicitly say anything about the truth value of any of these claims. He's not. That's why he's only a methodological atheist. He doesn't appeal to truth claims about religious ontology. But the effect of that is that for someone who took one of these traditions seriously, there are obvious explanations that he doesn't even consider. They're ruled out by this feature of his method, which is that I don't appeal to the ontology of any particular religious tradition. And again, I'm not saying he says that explicitly, but it's just, if you look at the way he treats the examples, it's never, it doesn't seem, occasionally he says things that suggest he's a Christian, but they're not part of the story about his explanation of whatever the tradition he's currently on about.
Can I just take one chance?
Sure.
To just follow? Just to try to understand this clearly. I mean, supposing somebody said, look, I'm interested in a kind of social history of religion, let's say. I don't know if this would count as a science of religion as far as you're concerned. But let's say they wanted to look at the origins of monotheism, let's say, and they looked at early Hebrew writings and they said, look, there seems to be an assertion that there's the God of Israel, but there are other gods. And then but our God is superior, and then this kind of merges into the idea there is only one God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that the kind of thing that could be the subject of any kind of, and what kind of study would that be?
Well, of course, I mean, it would be a historical study, as you said, and of course it's possible people do that sort of thing. The question is whether in doing it, and in calling what you want to develop a science of monotheism, say, you have to tell the story in a way that leaves out one possibility, which is they were just getting a deeper grip on how things really are. Monotheism is correct. That's what the missionaries thought. The missionaries thought, oh look, they believe in a high God. Great, they're on the way. Now Tyler doesn't rule that out, but he doesn't say ever explicitly there's no such thing. But he never appeals to the existence of anything in order to explain why anybody responds in the way that they do. And I'm just saying that seems to me, that fits with what I was calling the ethos of science, the idea that that if you're going to have a science of something, you don't commit yourself to any one of the, as it were, of the somethings, but that it's in the name of method there, you're essentially ruling out one intellectual possibility, by the way, an intellectual possibility that has been endorsed and embraced by large numbers of smart people over the course of human history. So I think these people could have had more discussion of why it was that they were proceeding in that way. And it's particularly interesting, as I say, that Tyler was a practicing Quaker. He wasn't just someone raised in Quaker traditions. So you'd have thought that at least he might have thought it was important to say something about why that wasn't the approach he adopted. As far as the wider intellectual picture here is concerned, when I finally write a book about all this, I will discuss James and Marx and Freud too. just didn't get to that today. I mean, they were doing, again, I think, slightly different things from these people. I think Marx's atheism is not methodological, for example.
Okay, so, yeah.
In accounting for the continuance of religions today, how would the sort of Darwinian inclined sociologist account for the fact that there are, in those areas of the world, say the Middle East and South Asia, where the penalty for apostasy is death, and there's a law about blasphemy, and the whole populace is ready to take it upon themselves to act upon that? You still get people who are prepared to say on the internet or that they are an atheist or they disagree with some aspect of the religion. I mean, why are these defectors so brave, is it, or foolhardy as to do that?
I'm not sure that the contemporary theorists that I have read address that particular question. They are, after all, trying, but in a way there's an excuse, they're trying to characterize, I mean, their question is, how did we come to have the minds that responded in the way they did to the kind of evidence that we had in our evolutionary history that led to our responding to that by developing these cognitive, the cognitive dimension of religious stuff. Other aspects of the modern evolutionary psychology of religion focus on the evolution of things more Durkheimian, more to do with institutions and structures, and less to do with the cognitive structure. But the person I was quoting is focusing on that. This view doesn't guarantee that we're all equipped with exactly the same agency detection device, or indeed that everybody is equipped with an agency detection device at all, which is one theory of some kinds of autism, is that people don't lack such a thing. It just explains why it would be extremely widespread, this tendency. So the fact that there are people, I mean, and there have been all along, we should point out, atheism wasn't invented in the 19th century. And there were non-believers in various aspects of the cognitive structure all along. Lucretius doesn't appear to think that it's a good idea to believe in the afterlife.
Thanks so much. I actually have two questions, looking at Lucy. The first one's a follow-up from before about why we can't have a science of religion, and it seems like it requires methodological atheism, which is kind of anti-cosmopolitan, therefore not scientific. So the same argument, I take it, applies to a science of morality. You can't have a science of morality because it would rule out what for a certain kind of moral Platonist is a live option, right? Which is to say, well, we have the moral beliefs we do because they are mind independently true. So I'm wondering how you feel about that analogy. That's the first question. Can I just go?
Yeah, sure.
And the second question has to do with the role of ontological commitment in those religions that, as it were, wear on their sleeve ontological commitment. So the Judeo-Christian religions, Islam. So it's become quite a fashionable thing, I think, in the anthropology of religion to say even those religions don't involve belief, right? Belief might be crucial to, belief in agents might be crucial to the historical emergence of those religions, but understanding those religions now doesn't involve some belief. So, someone like David Gellner says this about Indian religion. In the last century, Rodney Needham said this. Rowan Williams says that about Christianity, right? His kind of Christianity, at least. It's just moves in a language game. It's actually just an extension of ritual. So I'm wondering what you think about those kinds of arguments. I think a lot of philosophers think that those arguments make a mistake about belief. They think belief is a very demanding thing, and in fact, belief is something that can just be read off of action. So I'm wondering how you think about that question.
Okay, so, and the first question, sorry, as I've already lost track of, was...
A science of morality.
Oh, right. Well, science, the people who do the science of morality tend, almost all of them, people who think of themselves as doing a psychological science of morality, not the philosophers who think about these things, but the people in the psychology departments, as it were, tend to think that whatever the answer is, Platonism is not one of the possible answers. So they're methodologically atheist, as it were, about morality. They want to explain why we have the moral structures we have without assuming the truth of any particular moral system. So the answer is, it looks like that feature of the science of these things is shared with the science of morality. On the question of, I mean, there's two different issues about sort of non-theological, as it were, religion. One is what these theories should say about that, and I think because both Durkheim and Weber took forms of Buddhism to be atheistic and not even very clearly committed to the existence of the soul, they already had an answer, their answer was, in Weber's case, well, Buddhist priests engage in the management of charisma, and Durkheim's answer was that Buddhist priests distinguish between the sacred and the profane and do various things in order to mark that distinction. Tyler, I think, so the book is called Primitive Culture, and Tyler's method is evolutionarist. So he's trying to understand how these things started and then to see how the current state of things is the product of the historical development of these things whose initial setup he's explained. So it would be consistent with his view to say that once you've got one of these sort of theological things up and running, various historical processes can occur, which he would have been interested to study if he had still been alive, in which the theological cognitive part, as he would have conceived of it, fades away, and other features of these things continue. So, a Tylorian doesn't have to be committed to the idea that forever the things that grow out historically out of religion will be like the things at the start. The definition in terms of belief in spirits is meant to be, as it were, identifying the origin. But if he notices, for example, the point about the rise of monotheism, he notices that the number of spirits is already declining in some of these traditions, and he doesn't notice that it's gone down to zero for some of his contemporaries, but he does notice that the numbers decline. So I think you could imagine a Tylorian saying, this is a historical story. Our science explains why we started out in a certain way and how things might have grown out of it. It doesn't rule out that out of those things could grow something that lacked this initial feature, but it would have to rely on a historical explanation which appealed to something or other, which Tyler doesn't discuss because he didn't think it was, he wasn't thinking about the religions that you talk about in South Asia, say, or the Middle East, as sort of untheological. So you asked me what I think about this. I mean, it seems to me perfectly natural to see, well, two things. One is, I think, too demanding a notion of belief is going to produce a situation in which, especially for the vast bulk of human history, where the vast bulk of adherents of these religious traditions were non-literate and not very theoretically minded, it's going to involve treating them as not really being committed to the religions that were, in fact, institutionally speaking, the dominant religions of their societies. Because if you take the creedal parts of say, just take Christianity, right? The early councils of the church settle that to be a Christian you have to be a Trinitarian. I was prepared for confirmation in the Anglican Church. I don't understand Trinitarianism. I just don't know. I don't know what proposition is being expressed by someone who says, who refers to something as the doctrine of the Trinity. I suspect that if that's true of me, it's true of a lot of people since Trinitarianism was established, that there was this verbal formula that they knew they could get killed for denying, was putting a not in front of, but only a very few highly exalted literate people spent a lot of time actually really thinking about what it meant. And one could go through the creeds and ask which of the things is it reasonable to suppose that ordinary non-literate people actually in some sense believed and which they didn't. And I think what'll turn out to be the case, I think, in the case of the history of Christianity, is that the doctrines that historians of Christianity think of as definitive of Christianity were not just not held by most of the people who identified as Christians, they couldn't understand them. And I say that because I can't understand them. And I'm a moderately smart person.
So we've got 5 minutes and 3 questions. So
Okay,
so James, you're next.
Thanks. So I was wondering what the relationship is between your claim that there can't be a science of religion and the obvious fact that it seems that lots of religious claims can themselves be scientifically tested, whether doing a randomized controlled trial of the efficacy of prayer or looking at somebody in a brain scanner as they're meditating or performing biblical criticism or even posing something like the problem of evil. It seems that there are all sorts of ways in which one can attempt to provide universalistic models of reasoning to put some pressure on or examine religion. And I was wondering why, as it were, putting all those forms of universalistic reasoning together, we couldn't have something that was similar to a science, if not actually a science.
No, I mean, we could, and we could call it a science of religion if we liked. But it would be different from what I think of as these mainstreams in the history of this subject, even though, and one of the reasons I think is that apart from Tyler, all of them think that there's something very central to, that is both, all of them means beyond Weber and Durkheim, but including Weber and Durkheim. You think that something very central to the actual historical religions is not just about belief. And so, and for the reason I just said, I think it's certainly true that you don't need to look at brains to worry about the doctrine of the Trinity's coherence and intelligibility. I didn't look at brains to decide that I couldn't make sense of that. So yes, one can approach, but there one's approaching particular religions and particular claims and refuting those. Now the trouble with that, I think, is that isn't going to turn out to be a generalizable, that isn't going to be one project, because the creedal structures of the things that we now call religions are so diverse that, for example, you would find very little in fact, people do scientific studies of Buddhist meditation and they turn out to confirm some of the claims made by Buddhists about meditation. So there your scientific project would confirm some religious claims. And in other places, as you say, it would be claims in creation stories taken literally are inconsistent. You don't have to do experiments. They're wildly inconsistent with the best scientific theories of our day. And a person who's serious about the best scientific theories of our day simply can't accept them. So I think there would be a kind of, as it were, debunking activity. But then why focus on religions? I mean, you could just have an activity of debunking all kinds of different things. And because they have only this family resemblance to one another, what will, as it were, count as interesting ways of debunking one won't count as an interesting way of debunking the others. So while you can debunk specific claims made in specific religious traditions, if they're, we're in the building of Karl Popper, if they're falsifiable, that doesn't seem to be to, as it were, make a subject. It's just something you might do. And as I say, if you're going to be in the business of debunking, I recommend, there are lots of things. I mean, large areas of economics are in need of debunking by empirical study as well. So I'm not sure. What gives, in other words, what gives religion unity in the thinking of these people is not something that would, is not that they're wrong about things. And so there isn't a natural subject that consists in studying the things that they're wrong about. But you can study the things that they're wrong about, and people do.
going to allow, okay. I'm not going to allow anybody any more questions because actually we are out of time. And I want to thank Professor Appiah for a incredibly rich, enjoyable lecture that led to a fantastic discussion. So, can we thank you?